The U.S.-China trade war has overshadowed other diplomatic issues as G7 leaders wrap up their summit in Biarritz, France. After a weekend of intense feuding and tit-for-tat tariffs, U.S. President Donald Trump today tried to calm things down. He said China had made contact with U.S. officials and that both sides would soon return to the negotiating table. Now, for more, Aurel Braun joins us live from New York. He is Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto. Thank you very much, Professor Braun. First up, what's your take on France's surprise invitation of Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif to the summit?
The French have been very keen to try to save the nuclear agreement with Iran. And that is because France has the prospect of making very significant profits. Large French companies were trying to get into Iran, Total, for example, Peugeot, Citroën. And traditionally, what the French have been able to do was to get American protection while they were making profits. Under Mr. Trump, this is going to be much more difficult. So according to some observers, we're trying to make an end run around the United States, but I don't think that's really possible. According to Mr. Trump, he gave consent that they would meet, but of course, any agreement has to go not through Brussels, not through Paris. The geopolitical reality is that it has to go through Washington.
So do you think then that the G7 moved the needle then? Are they any closer on agreement on Iran than they were before the summit began?
It's difficult to see that because for there to be an agreement, Iran would have to change its behavior dramatically. Iran had an extraordinarily advantageous agreement under the Obama administration. It was able to access up to $150 billion, while it only promised that for a period of time would not concentrate on making the bomb. But all of the other elements of nuclear weapons, the delivery systems, the command and control systems, those have been pursued by Iran very avidly. As you know, they tested some ballistic missiles recently. Those were not banned. Iran has also continued to engage in expanding in the region, whether it is supporting the Houthis, whether it is propping up the Assad regime, whether it is funding the terrorist groups Hamas and Hezbollah. And so its behavior had not changed. And the United States is basically demanding that there has to be a kind of holistic package, that the entire behavior of the regime has to change. And this regime depends on these kind of foreign adventures. I mean, let's not forget, this is a regime that is one of the most repressive and one of the most corrupt on the planet. It is a tragedy for the Iranian people. It is a danger to the region. And it's very difficult to see how they would change dramatically. They may perhaps moderate their behavior if they can see that they cannot get some dramatic change. But ultimately, it is hard to see how there could be a really fundamental shift in how this Iranian regime behaves externally and internally.
Professor Braun, let's look at the other issue as well. Mr. Trump renewed his call to get Russia back into what would be the G8. He said that others support his call. Question is, how feasible is this idea, though?
It will be difficult because Russia continues to occupy a part of Ukraine. It has formally annexed the Crimean Peninsula. In many countries, Canada included, has called this absolutely illegal and unacceptable. Mr. Putin is not willing to move on this. And it is curious why Mr. Trump is pushing so hard for this, because today the Russians themselves came back and they said that they would return only if there is a consensus, only if all of the countries go along with it. And that consensus will be very difficult to achieve. The other matter is that there is a kind of advantage to having a club of democracies. You can discuss things within the 7 that you may not be able to discuss within the 8. After all, there is another club, the G20, where Russia, China, other countries do participate.
And how would you rate this summit then in terms of the success, especially compared to last year? I mean, it did get somewhat distracted by the arrival of Iran, by forest fires in Brazil, and also sort of the ongoing U.S.-China trade war.
it's going to look more successful than last year because of the way it was structured. It had a very ambitious agenda, but it was also one that was kind of elastic. So they can claim that there may be some progress on fighting inequalities. This is what the host, Mr. Macron, pushed for. And they may say that there has been some movement on climate change, not in the case of the United States. But in terms of really substantive changes, perhaps one can look more at bilateral matters. United States and Japan did get together, and they agreed in principle on a trade arrangement that could be worth up to $7 trillion. If that materializes, that would be significant. Mr. Modi is going to meet the Indian leader, also with Mr. Trump, so that could be positive as well. So the atmospherics are better here. Everybody wanted to make certain that they do not anger Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump played a kind of yo-yo diplomacy, where on the one hand he was provocative, on another hand he was reassuring. After all, United States will be holding and hosting the G7 meeting next year. So there is an incentive for Mr. Trump to look good, to part on good terms with the other members of the group. So I think overall there will be more claims for success, but substantively, I think it will be considerably short of at least the very ambitious goals set out by Mr. Macron.
All right. Well, many thanks for your thoughts this evening, Professor Aurel Braun from the University of Toronto.